Okay, so let's say you're looking ahead to 2024, right? You're thinking about the election and kind of wondering, what a potential Trump presidency, what that might mean for your investments.
Oh,
It's a big question, right? And I think you're smart to be thinking about it.
absolutely.
We've got our market expert here to kind of help us sift through the noise and figure out what we can actually learn from all this.
Happy to dive in.
So I think the big question on your mind, and frankly in a lot of people's minds, is can we actually predict what the market's going to do based on who's in the White House?
Yeah.
It's almost a given, right, that people think Republican presidents are better for the stock market.
Yeah, that's definitely a common assumption.
Right.
And to be fair, there is some historical data that backs it up, though maybe not as strongly as you might think.
Interesting.
So we took a look at this YouTube video by Graham Stephan called "The Trump Economy: My Insane Stock Market Prediction for 2025."
Okay.
And he pulled some numbers going all the way back to 1957. And it turns out that Republican presidents do see a slightly higher average return in the market, around 10.2%,
Okay.
compared to 9.93% for Democrats.
Interesting. So there is something to that Republicans are good for the market?
Well, hold on a second.
Okay.
That difference is really pretty small.
Okay.
And as any good data cruncher will tell you, just because two things happen around the same time, doesn't mean one causes the other.
Right.
There are a lot of other factors at play here, and Stefan digs into some of them in his video.
Okay. So if it's not just about the president, what else is going on? What does Stefan say is important?
Well, one of the biggest things he points to is the power of Congress,
Okay.
which I think people often overlook.
Yeah.
The president can't just snap their fingers and make big changes happen.
Right.
Things like tax policies or new regulations, those have to go through the House and the Senate, checks and balances in action, right?
Right. The president can't act alone on those things.
Exactly. And when Stefan looked at the historical data, he found something pretty fascinating.
Oh, really?
It turns out that a divided Congress, meaning one party controls the House and the other controls the Senate, actually tends to result in the highest market returns.
Hmm.
We're talking 13.7% average returns with a Republican president and a divided Congress, and 13.6% for a Democrat president in the same situation.
Wow, gridlock is good for the market. Who knew?
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But the numbers don't lie.
Right.
And what's even more interesting is that, according to Stefan's research, the second highest returns historically happen when you have a fully Republican-controlled Congress, regardless of who the president is.
So what you're telling me is that simply looking at the president's party isn't enough.
Right.
We've got to factor in Congress, too.
Absolutely.
But there's another big assumption that always seems to come up around this time.
Yeah.
That what's good for businesses is automatically good for everyone else. That whole trickle-down theory.
Mm-hmm.
Stefan doesn't seem to be buying that, does he?
Not so much. He's pretty skeptical. You know how businesses always say they'll reinvest their tax savings to create jobs and boost the economy?
Right.
Well, Stefan points out that there's really no guarantee that those savings will actually trickle down to workers or benefit the average person.
Right.
Think of it like pouring water into a leaky bucket.
Okay.
A lot of it might just disappear before it reaches the bottom.
So even if a president pushes policies that are supposedly good for businesses, that doesn't necessarily translate into gains for everyday people like you and me.
Exactly. And Stefan has some interesting examples to back this up. He looked at how clean energy stocks performed compared to traditional energy stocks under both Trump and Biden.
Okay.
You'd think that with Biden's focus on clean energy, those stocks would soar during his presidency.
Makes sense.
And that traditional energy would have done better under Trump, who's more supportive of fossil fuels, right?
That's what you'd assume based on their policies.
But get this, clean energy actually did much better under Trump. It outperformed traditional energy by a whopping 43% annually during his presidency. And under Biden, traditional energy actually came out on top, outperforming clean energy by 53% a year. So it seems like the connection between a president's policies and how different sectors of the market perform is more complex than we might think.
Wow. So much for simple assumptions.
Yeah.
Sounds like we really do need to look beyond those surface level connections like you said.
Absolutely. And Fidelity, the investment firm, actually made a really interesting point about this. They said that it's actually pretty rare for presidents to deliver on all of their campaign promises once they're in office.
I think we all know that's true.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're making investment decisions based solely on what a candidate says they're going to do, you might be setting yourself up for disappointment.
So with all this uncertainty, what does this mean for people like you who are trying to figure out how to invest their money wisely?
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy to feel like you're just throwing darts at a board.
This is where Stefan's advice gets really practical and honestly a bit reassuring. He basically says, don't get caught up in all the political drama. Instead, focus on what you can actually control, your own personal finances.
I love that. Back to the basics, right?
Right.
So what does that look like in practice? What kind of things does Stefan recommend?
He talks about things like, taking on some overtime work
Okay.
to boost your income,
Hmm.
learning new skills that can make you more valuable in the job market, and really focusing on building a stable career.
Right.
And of course, he emphasizes managing your expenses carefully
Of course.
and, most importantly, investing consistently.
Yeah, it's all about building that strong foundation
Hmm.
step by step. And it's kind of empowering, actually, instead of worrying about what's happening in Washington.
Right.
You can take concrete actions
Yeah.
to improve your own financial situation.
It makes a lot of sense.
That is.
Those are the things that'll have a direct and immediate impact on your financial well-being, way more than anything a president can do.
Okay, so we've established that the presidency isn't the only factor, or even the most important factor,
Right.
when it comes to market performance. But I'm curious, did Stephen dive into any specific policies or proposals from Trump
He did.
that might give us a clue about what his presidency could mean for investors?
Yeah, he talked about some key areas, particularly around taxes,
Okay.
that could have implications for businesses and individuals.
Okay, let's talk taxes. What did Stephen highlight?
Well, he pointed out that if Trump were to be elected again, it's unlikely that capital gains and income tax rates would change much.
So no major shakeups there for most people.
Right. But he did mention that estate and wealth tax cuts would probably be made permanent, though he also pointed out that this would really only affect people with estates worth over $28 million.
So for the vast majority of us, not a huge game changer.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to businesses, things get a little more interesting. Stefan mentioned that Trump has talked about lowering the corporate income tax rate potentially down to 15% for companies that manufacture their products here in the United States.
That's a pretty significant cut. What's the thinking behind that?
The idea is that it would save businesses a lot of money, which in theory could lead to more investment, more jobs being created, and ultimately a boost to the economy. But as Stephen pointed out, there's always the risk that companies might just take that extra cash and will keep it for themselves instead of putting it back into the economy.
It's that age-old debate. Will tax cuts actually trickle down and benefit everyone?
Right.
Or will they just make the rich richer?
Exactly. And that's a key question for investors to consider. Stephen also brought up tariffs, which were a big part of Trump's economic policy during his previous term.
Ah, yes. Tariffs, always a hot-button issue. What's the thinking on those these days?
Well, Stephen mentioned that Trump has floated the idea of imposing tariffs on goods imported from China, possibly ranging from 10% to as high as 60%.
Whoa, 60%? That's a pretty steep tariff.
Yeah.
What would be the impact of something like that?
It's tough to say for sure, but some experts think that tariffs like that could actually lead to higher prices for consumers here in the U.S. as businesses pass those increased costs on to us.
Hmm.
Others argue that tariffs could help protect American jobs and industries from foreign competition.
It's definitely a complex issue.
Yeah.
With potential winners and losers on both sides.
For sure. And it's something investors will need to consider carefully as they think about different investment strategies and how they might be affected by these policies.
So we've got potential tax cuts for businesses, the possibility of new tariffs, and the big question mark of whether any of this will actually translate into the economic benefits that are being promised.
Right.
It's a lot to think about. But beyond these specific policies,
Yeah.
what was Stefan's overall take on how a Trump presidency might affect the average person's financial situation?
Well, he was pretty upfront about the fact that it's impossible to predict with any certainty. He acknowledged that some people might see their finances improve, particularly those who own businesses or have investments that would benefit from the proposed tax cuts.
That makes sense.
But he also said that a lot of people might not see much of a difference at all, and some people might even see a negative impact like those higher prices we talked about because of tariffs.
So it really depends on your individual situation and how things actually shake out.
Right.
It's hard to make any blanket statements.
And that's where I think Stephen's advice about focusing on what you can control comes in again. It's about taking proactive steps to strengthen your own financial position, regardless of who's president or what policies they enact.
Exactly. Back to those fundamentals again.
Absolutely. Focus on things like boosting your income, keeping your expenses in check, and investing wisely. Those are the things that are going to have the biggest impact on your financial future in the long run.
Okay, we've explored the potential policy impacts of a Trump presidency, but now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something that I think often gets overlooked in these kinds of discussions, the emotional side of investing.
Yes, the psychology of investing.
Yeah.
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle for sure.
It's so easy to let our emotions, especially fear and greed, get the better of us when it comes to money, especially during times of political uncertainty. Did Stefan touch on this at all?
He didn't get into the psychological aspects in great detail, but he did emphasize the importance of staying rational and sticking to your long-term investment plan no matter what's happening in the news or the political arena.
That's so important, isn't it? It's easy to panic when the market takes a dip
Yep.
or get caught up in the hype when a particular stock is making headlines.
It is, and that's exactly why it's crucial to have a well-thought-out investment strategy and stick to it no matter what. Don't let your emotions drive your investment decisions.
Don't panic sell when the market drops, and don't chase after the latest hot stock just because everyone else is talking about it.
Exactly. Stay disciplined, stay informed, and remember that investing is a long game.
Words to live by. So we've covered a lot of ground here, the historical data, the potential policy impacts, and the importance of keeping our emotions in check when it comes to investing. But before we wrap things up, there's one more piece of the puzzle I want to bring up.
What's that?
The bigger picture, I'm talking about the broader economic trends and forces that could shape the market landscape, regardless of who wins the election. The kind of things that are happening, whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House.
That's a great point. It's easy to get so focused on the political horse race that we forget about all the other factors that influence the market. Remember, the
Yeah.
market doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's influenced by things happening all over the world.
Exactly. The world is a complicated place and everything is interconnected.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important for investors to have a good understanding of these broader trends and how they might impact their portfolios.
So we need to zoom out a bit and look beyond just the political landscape.
Exactly.
Totally.
Think about things like interest rates, inflation, and even things like disruptions to global supply chains. All of these things can have a big impact on the market, regardless of who's president.
So even if we could perfectly predict the outcome of the election, which, let's face it, we can't, there are still so many other factors that are going to come into play.
That's right, and that's why it's so important to have a diversified investment portfolio. Stay informed about what's happening in the world, and remember that investing is a marathon, not a sprint.
Great advice.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the potential market implications of a Trump presidency, I think the key takeaway is that there are no easy answers or guarantees.
I completely agree. It's a complex and constantly evolving landscape.
But by understanding the historical trends, the potential impact of different policies, the importance of managing our emotions, and those big picture economic forces at play, we can make more informed and strategic decisions.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to investing.
And hey, regardless of what happens on the political stage,
Mm.
you have the power to shape your own financial future.
I couldn't agree more. It really comes down to, taking charge of the things you can control
Right.
and making smart choices that align with your own, personal goals and circumstances.
That's such a crucial point.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the hype and the headlines
Yeah,
and forget that we actually have a lot of control over our own financial destiny.
absolutely. We've thrown a lot of information at you in this deep dive, but hopefully you're walking away with a better understanding of how politics and the markets are intertwined,
Right.
and even more importantly, how you can navigate this complex landscape with confidence.
When you first started thinking about this whole Trump in the market thing,
Mm-hmm.
it probably felt pretty overwhelming. Like, where do you even begin to untangle all of that?
Probably, yeah. But remember, it's not about trying to predict the unpredictable.
Right.
It's about building a solid financial foundation for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
staying informed about what's happening in the world, and being ready to adapt to whatever challenges or opportunities come your way.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to you, listener, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep investing in yourself and your future. Until next time.